as well as other types of federal and non-federal funding opportunities. It will not go into any details of the TCR Annual Awards program. So for that information, please tune in to our FAQ webinar next Wednesday, August 2nd, from 1 o'clock to 2:30 p.m. Central Time Zone. Again, please make sure you're muted while our presenters are speaking. We encourage everyone to turn on your video if you would like to do so, as this is an interactive workshop. And with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers. Mead, you're welcome to put up your presentation. Our two speakers today are Chaz Jones. Chaz Jones is the director of the ATNI Climate Change Program, and Mead Crosby, who's the senior scientist at the Climate Impacts Group and university director of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, based out of University of Washington. And with that, I'll turn it over to the two of you to give more detailed introductions and get going with this workshop. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you all. Really appreciate you being here today. Mead and I are going to be talking to you about Grant Writing 101. It's going to be a relatively basic presentation on how you can access more funding for your climate program. And I'm Chaz Jones. I work for the Affiliated Tribes and Northwest Indians, and I'm the program director for the Climate Resilience Program. I'm located in Philomath, Oregon, and the ATNI member tribes make up the tribes that are located in Washington, Idaho, Oregon, Montana, Northeast California, and Southeastern Alaska. We work to promote tribal sovereignty and self-determination, and my program specifically works to benefit the tribes in the Northwest to help them become more climate resilient. I've been working with tribes for over 20 years and have been relatively successful in helping them access additional grant funds, not only for the ATNI, but also for the individual member tribes. Mead, I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself. You're muted.
There we go. Sorry, I didn't see how to do that while I was sharing, so give me 1 second and I'll reshare here. There we go. All right, you seeing my screen again?
Everything looks good.
Awesome, thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I'm Mead Crosby, senior scientist with the Climate Impacts Group at University of Washington and university director of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center here at University of Washington, located in Seattle, Washington on Coast Salish lands. I am not tribally affiliated. I have had the privilege to collaborate with many different tribes and intertribal organizations throughout the Northwest and nationally on climate adaptation planning efforts, including participating in grant writing to support that work with tribal partners, and in providing resources and training to tribes to support their own grant writing for their climate work. In my role at the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, I also review grant proposals, and I fund with my partners at the CAF graduate and postdoctoral researchers, soon to be also including faculty and professional scientists throughout the Northwest to support climate adaptation. And this is research that is often done in partnership with tribes. So if folks could take a moment now, we'd love for, there's actually quite a lot of you on the call, so this will be a busy chat, but if you'd like to enter your own name and location and tribal affiliation or organization and your role in the chat, that would be great to see who all we are speaking with today.
But, and while folks are entering information into the chat, again, we'd love to see who's out there. I'm going to talk a little bit about the objectives that we have for today's webinar. And first of all, we're going to have, we're going to be providing an exercise worksheet. And so you'll be able to follow along I'm going to not do that until folks settle down in the introductions. So that way the link to the worksheet doesn't get lost in the chat. In that same document, there will also be a grant writing checklist and a list of resources that you can access. And they will all be located in the link that I will put in the chat after the chat box settles down a little bit. But next slide. So we're going to be talking a bit about familiarizing you with the grant writing workshop or the grant writing process, and as just mentioned, providing resources for climate related funding and helping you identify where to go to find those funds. And then we're also going to be we're hoping that you can develop a shared learning community around grant funding by seeing who's here, reaching out to folks that you connect with, and start to build your project team. Next slide. In this grant writing workshop, we're going to be talking about 10 different things, and that's going to be how to define your project, developing a funding strategy, building your team, identifying your project partners, finding funding opportunities, developing your budget and developing your project timeline, developing a grant narrative that's relevant to the funding opportunities that you're finding, and then developing your executive summary, your project summary, and then soliciting feedback and submitting that grant. So basically just kind of walking you through the overall steps of what you can do to be most successful in your grant writing efforts. Now I'm going to let Mead talk about defining your project team.
Thanks, Chaz. All right, so getting started, first steps in putting together a grant proposal. You're going to want to think about what it is you're actually proposing and build the team to help you get that proposal together. So the first step is going to be to define your project. What is it that you would like to get grant funding for? So the first thing you need to do in thinking about defining your project is identifying the need. So what is it that your proposed work is going to address? What need is it going to address if it's funded? What is the problem that your work is going to solve? What is the challenge that it's going to meet? So in this case, it's going to be something about climate change. Is it specifically about preparing for climate change by conducting a vulnerability assessment or completing an adaptation plan? Is it implementing your plans for responding to climate change, perhaps making changes to infrastructure or health systems or wildlife management? Or maybe you want funding, maybe the need is to help support reducing carbon emissions by studying options for installing renewable energy projects. So defining the need is just asking, what is it you're going to do? What problem or challenge is it going to address? Once you've identified your need, you can then be a little bit more specific. So what are your goals and objectives in completing this work and meeting that need? What specific activities or tasks are you going to complete to support those objectives, those things that you're aiming to get done through this work? What is it you're going to actually do to address this need that you've identified? And then finally, in defining your project, you want to think about what are the desired outcomes and outputs of the work that you're proposing. So these can be very specific, concrete products like completing a vulnerability assessment or a climate adaptation plan, but it could also be some more sort of intangible outcomes like increasing capacity of your tribe to address climate change or building a stronger network or community for completing climate work. And now I can't see the chat, so I don't know if it's calmed down or not, but I know Chaz is going to share a link to a worksheet that we prepared for you all to help work through some of these questions as we're meeting here. So Chaz, is that link in the chat now for folks?
Yes, it is.
Awesome. Okay, so if y'all could take a moment and go into the chat and get that link to the worksheet and download it. Hopefully you can start working through some of these questions just very quickly. Just take a few minutes right now to fill in your worksheet around what the need is that your project could be addressing. And again, you may be coming to this workshop without a specific project in mind, and that's okay. For the purposes of this workshop, just to get the wheels turning, think of any need that you're aware of in your community with your organization or tribe around climate change, and let's just do this as an exercise if you don't already have a particular idea. If you can't print out or interact with the PDF that we're sharing, use a notebook, use a Word document. You don't have to fill it out in the worksheet if you're having a hard time accessing that and interacting with it.
And I'll just mention that we have folks from across the nation, a lot of folks in the Pacific Northwest calling in. We have folks from the Modoc, Oklahoma, Utah. I see folks from the East Coast calling in, Arizona, Alaska, really all over. So thank you for being here. Really appreciate it.
If you have any questions as you're working through this, feel free to put them in the chat. We're hoping to be very interactive here, or just you can unmute and ask. Has anyone not been able to get hold of the worksheet at this point? And Chaz, I can't see the chat, so I don't know if people are responding.
There's no responses. It looks like there's not been any problems. Hopefully they're downloading it and using it.
Okay.
So maybe we can go to this, move on. Unless you want to ask anybody if they're trying, what they're doing, what they come up with.
All right. If anyone needs more time, let us know, but otherwise we'll move on. I know people might need another extra minute or so to get ready with the.
Mark Healy says that he doesn't have the worksheet. Mark, are you seeing the link in the chat? And are you able to access it?
I will say these questions we have here are very similar, the ones on the screen, to what's in the worksheet. So you can always just use these questions on the screen and just start jotting notes down in a notebook or on a Word doc. That'll get you very close to what's in the worksheet.
I don't have the worksheet.
George, are you able to see the chat box?
No.
On my computer in the upper left, there's a link to the chat. There's a button for the chat. If you click on that, that should give you access to the chat box. Do you see that? And Tawana's asking if everyone can be emailed the link.
That's a great idea.
That's oh, Lisa, maybe you can answer that question. But I suspect they can make that happen.
Okay. All right, why don't we move on to the next section here? And Chaz, if you want to work with folks in the BI office to see if they can mail this out, that'd be awesome while we move on. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so you have defined your need and thought about your goals and objectives. You've thought about your desired outcomes. And we will return to that more in a bit in more detail. But generally speaking, when you're thinking about applying for a grant, you're thinking about your need. You may want to think about developing a funding strategy. So how are you going to fund this project? One thing to consider is that projects don't, especially big projects, they don't necessarily have to be funded or completed all at once. You might develop a longer term strategy for funding this work, perhaps by dividing it into a series of smaller fundable projects. And that can be helpful for a number of different reasons. It can lower some of that barrier to entry. It can seem like maybe too big of a project to try to tackle all at once, try to fund all at once. So if you can break it down to a series of smaller fundable projects, it can maybe make it a little more tractable. And these smaller projects can build on one another, become sequential proposals, a series of smaller proposals that can build into that larger project and those larger goals and objectives you want to complete. Another benefit of doing this is that if you don't have a track record of funding, if you don't have evidence of some success in doing this kind of work, then starting with smaller proposals and building from there can help build funders' confidence in your team. So successfully completing smaller projects can make funding sponsors more likely to fund larger projects over time. So again, if you're just if this is a new big thing that you're moving into with climate work or with a particularly ambitious project you want to get done, you can consider going after, single large grants, but definitely encourage you to think about whether it might be possible to break it down into smaller pieces. You'll also then want to think about who you might want or need to partner with to complete this work. So you might want to take a moment to think about whether you have all of the necessary and knowledge and expertise required to get this work done. It may be that you have all the expertise you need in your organization or your tribe, and you'll want to reach out to those folks to see if they want to work with you on this. But you may also want to consider if there's missing expertise for the project that you might want to find outside and partner with. Would it be helpful to partner with a climate science organization or an adaptation planning organization, a renewable energy organization? It's not required, but it can be helpful to think about, to recognize that this is an opportunity for potentially building a larger community around this work you want to do and bringing them in at the proposal stage. So if you've identified some necessary expertise within or outside of your organization, one thing to consider in whether to formally bring them on board to a proposal is their availability. They may have the expertise that you need. Are they actually going to be available and have the time to collaborate effectively on this project with you? There are some really excellent, for example, scientists out there or others who are so good at what they do that they are just incredibly busy, and they might be really great to have on your team, except that it's going to be hard to actually get them to contribute. So thinking realistically around whether potential partners can actually engage or not in the work is really important, because if they can't, you're going to still be stuck with that work. Some partners are actually required to access funding. So you might see funding opportunities for the work that you want to do, but maybe it's only for a specific kind of organization or in a specific region. That might not be you. And so you might think creatively about whether you could partner with one of those organizations to pursue that work, even though you're not the target audience for that work. So partnering is also a way to access funds that may not have been earmarked for or intended for your particular kind of organization. So another reason to think about partnering. Some partners some funding opportunities, I should say, may require letters of support. And so you'll want to be thinking about what individuals or entities would be able to provide a letter of support for you. Many grants do require letters of support. So who knows you, who knows your team, who knows your tribe or organization, and would be able to speak compellingly to your ability to complete this project and why it's important. So identifying early on, thinking about who could provide those kinds of letters if they're required. And I'll just note that many letter writers, speaking as someone who's written these letters and someone who's requested these letters many times, it's very helpful if you actually do a lot of the work for them in writing that letter. So if you ask someone to write a letter for you, noting that giving as much guidance as possible and maybe providing a template for them where if there's anything you want them to say, you just tell them what you would like them to really highlight in that letter and providing it as a few bullets. That can help make them less likely to say no, because they'll be like, oh, look, my letter's partially ready for me. And it'll help get you the letter that you need.
And Mead, we have a question in the chat box. Tawana, would you like to ask that question out loud, or would you prefer me to read it? I think Tawana is on the phone. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and read the question. And this, yeah. So a question about partners. How can we distinguish partners that we secure before we apply versus partners who we need to issue a formal solicitation or a bid for, such as contractors that they're going to have to ask for a bid?
Oh yeah, good point.
Is there a financial threshold that they would need, such as financial threshold, before they have to send that bid out for contract? And
yeah. Right. Okay. So are you asking in terms of, is this in the case where you've gotten an award and you could use some outside support, and so you're putting a solicitation out to find contractors to help execute the award that you've gotten? Or is this a case where you're the funder it's not a pass through, you have money and you're trying to find people to do the work?
So Tawana Cervantes is a contractor for the Campo Band of Mission Indians in California. It sounds like she's a contractor that works for a tribe. In my experience, Tawana, that threshold is somewhat dependent upon the organization that receives the grant. Some have a $25,000 threshold. Some require things going out to contract with just $5,000. It really depends internally, is what I've experienced. Do you know any different?
No, that sounds exactly right. And we also have our own rules around, if it's below a certain amount, then it doesn't have to go out. If it's above a certain amount, it has to be a contract. And also you have to provide sole source justification if you don't put it out to bid, like why. Sometimes you can get around the putting out to bid if there's a very specific reason that this individual or this organization is uniquely qualified to do the work. Like you have a long history of working together. They're the only ones with the expertise to do the work. So sometimes you can get around it if there's some kind of sole source justification.
Yeah, and just a follow-up, she's asking if there's a specific federal procurement rule associated with this. I don't know if there's one ubiquitous rule across all federal agencies because they're quite diverse. They all have a lot of, but I think in the workshop that's coming up for the BIA, you can ask that question. They're going to have an FAQ coming up in the next couple of weeks, and Coral, I think, is going to share more information about that later. But there'll be a FAQ coming up, and I think that you can ask that question of them specifically about the BIA's program.
Yes, and I'll put a link in the chat for that, for that webinar now, and I'll share that again at the end of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Coral.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mead.
Okay. All right, so you've thought about your need, you've thought about what partners you might want, and now you might think about how to build a proposal writing team. And maybe you're catching a theme here, which is that a lot of what we're talking about is basically not doing all of this alone, right? You're thinking about partners, you're thinking about who can do this work with you, all from the very beginning. And so when you're ready to think about pursuing this grant and write the proposal, again, think about who can do this with you so it's not all on you. These members of your team, they could be tribal staff or staff at a intertribal org, if that's where you are. Your colleagues who would be good partners in writing this with you, and they may or may not be the ones who will actually work on the grant with you. There may be folks who would be, for many different reasons, willing or able to help you work on the proposal, and they may or may not be the ones who will be actually doing the work with you, though it is more likely that they will write it with you if they're going to work on it with you, but you never know. You may, if you're working with any outside consultants or contractors who might be part of the group of partners, doing this proposed work, they may be very likely to work on the proposal with you. Pretty much anyone who you've identified as part of your team in doing the work may be willing to work on the proposal with you. Hopefully they are. You might ask for some help from your regional Climate Adaptation Science Center, tribal liaisons. We'll talk a little bit more about these folks in a moment, but they often help tribes and tribal orgs in their region pursue funding opportunities, and we'll point you to these folks in a moment. Your tribe may have a grant coordinator. They may have a grant writer, and if they have one, and I've heard before, folks didn't realize that there was a grant coordinator at their tribe or a grant writer. So first ask around, do you have one? If you're not aware of them, maybe if you're a larger organization or government, do you have one? Reach out to them so they know that you're planning on writing a proposal. Can they assist you in writing this proposal? Make sure to take that step of reaching out to them and seeing if they're available. And they might also help ensure that there isn't competition within your tribe for the same funding opportunities. So maybe you weren't aware that another department was going to also apply for the same grant, and hopefully the grant coordinator would be aware of that and help you guys work it out. Maybe you can partner and do it together. Any other partner, again, that you're planning on doing the work with, move them into proposal writing, even if it's just their section, like they can write a piece of work that they're going to do for the proposal, for the proposed work, they could write that part of the proposal. And then again, your writers of letters of support. So sometimes these will be required. You will be required to have letters of support. Sometimes they'll just be allowed. So they may welcome letters of support, but they may not ask for them specifically. Highly encourage including them if they're allowed, even if they're not required. So again, who can speak to the importance of the work that you're proposing, and especially your ability to complete that work? Ask them for a letter, ask them early, and as much as possible, help write that letter for them. I know that sounds like a pain. It is a pain, and it is so worth it to just get those bullets down of what you would like them to highlight, and make sure you have a nice template for them and they're more likely to write it in that case. These letters are very powerful. I'll pass it back to Jazz.
Thank you. And I just see someone's asking for the link to the worksheet. Or
We got it, Chaz.
thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so as part of your team, one of the types of partners that Mead mentioned is the potential for hiring a grant writing consultant. And in some cases, some folks will actually help you or even write the entire grant for you or work with you to write the grant. And that can be very helpful and take a lot of pressure off of your limited tribal staff. It seems that all the tribes that I've been working with for a long time have been very limited in capacity. And when these grant opportunities come up, it can be a real burden to try to find time to pull everything together especially in a way that's not stressful. So hiring a grant writer can be an asset, but it's really important to know that even when you hire a grant writer, you are still responsible for what is written in that work and what you've said that you would do, even if someone else writes it for you. There's some issues with grant writers. They may not have the most effective background to tell the story that you are wanting to tell. They may not know everything about the topic that you are proposing that you would like them to write about. And sometimes the expenses for hiring that grant writer actually are not covered in the specific grant opportunity you have. So you may need to find another way to fund them. They can be really helpful. Some of them might go beyond just grant writing. They might help you administer the grant or with project management efforts. It's really depending on the folks that you identify as a preferred partner to work with. And getting back to that aspect of that you are responsible for what is identified as an objective and a deliverable in the grant, it's really important that even if you hire this grant writer, that you review the proposal thoroughly and that you're comfortable with the identified deliverables in that project. So I've definitely seen folks that hire a grant writer sign off on it without really paying that close of attention to what was written, and then not happy with the end result of the project that they did get funded, but they're now responsible for implementing. It's also important that you know that you, the tribe or the tribal organization, have the people and the systems and the plan in place to carry out the project, because that grant writer may not be super familiar with your staff, with their expertise, and with your organizational systems. So do you have the financial systems in place to actually track the funding as you might need to for a larger grant? Or do you have a cultural resources expert that can help you, or has time available and the capacity to fulfill the grant obligations to go out and do a community survey? Say you're going to do it, you're going to be responsible for doing that, but do the staff that you've identified or that you have actually have time to implement it? So something to think about when hiring a grant writing consultant. The other alternative, next slide. The other alternative is that you write proposals in-house, and this can be very effective, and very successful. I would say that there's many tribes that do not hire grant consultants or don't have a grant writer on staff, but that their staff, all their existing staff, pitch in to write the proposals in-house. This can be great because as a program director or a grant writer, you may know the staff, the staff that you have an understanding of their capacity and their expertise. But it does take a lot of time and a lot of resources. In some cases, it takes weeks that you have to pull away to write the proposal, and you have an unknown success rate. You do not know if you're going to be successful in accessing those funds, and so you may spend a lot of time on something that provides little to no benefit in the immediate short term. So as Mead was talking, it's really important, if you're going to be writing a proposal in-house, it's really important that you develop a team, that you don't take it on yourself, that you have your administrative staff, your budgeting staff, or folks that understand your HR, help you fill out the budget, help you develop a timeline, talk to the people who would be involved in the project, and know whether or not they have capacity, not just now, but in 6 months when this project is being actually developed and implemented. And I just made up the term 6 months. It could be a year out, but they're going to have a sense for where they are and what their staff availability is. It's also going to, if you have a team approach, you also help develop some sort of accountability. Each person takes on a certain portion of the grant, and they have a better understanding of that portion of the grant and can be somewhat accountable for implementation of the grant when it comes in. And again, it can be a lot of effort to develop in time and both resources to develop a proposal, but it can be very fruitful. A lot of the funding that comes into Indian Country is from grants, from both foundations, federal government, state governments, and others. Many of us spend a lot of time on grants, and you should not shy away from them. But the administrative burden, it's something that often is also not quite accounted for, is the administrative burden, the overhead that's associated with just administering the grant. So again, you could contract that out, but a lot of times you don't. But there's a lot of people here to help. As Mead mentioned, you can have a full team. And I see that somebody in the chat saying that there's a grant. The grants professional organization is a great resource for finding and vetting consultants and helping your team build their grant skills. And they have a strong code of ethics. So thank you for sharing that link, Alexander.
And Chaz, if you weren't able to get to it already, there was another question a little earlier in the chat about partners. From Tawana.
I'm seeing it now. Tawana Cervantes asked a while back, when we talk about partners, it is confusing because the partners are not other governmental aid entities, such as nonprofits or nonprofit businesses. They will normally automatically receive public grant funds without openly competing for the use of funds. Have that clear how we choose a partner that does not have to compete to be part of the application and the project versus an organization that we have to solicit openly. How do we make sure that we are not inadvertently going around the open competition solicitation process by calling someone a partner up front? You know, there's a lot of, I would suggest that many times these partners are folks that without their expertise and their skills, that the organization receiving the funding may be less qualified to actually implement the project. And so quite often in these grants, you identify a partner as someone basically that you are planning to bring on and is willing and has the capacity to bring on. You may have to put that out to bid later. And while you can hope that that person is qualified and is the best qualified entity to help be that partner, that's somewhat of a risk on their part to identify them as a partner and to offer the opportunity for you to include them in your application process. It's not guaranteed that they're going to get it in all cases. And so I don't think you have to worry about it too much at this when you're writing the grants, but identifying them as a partner and getting their resumes and qualifications into your application packet can be a very, very big benefit. Otherwise, just identifying random consultant that you don't know to help you achieve this one aspect of a project sounds very, pie in the sky and uncertain. And I think that the grant writers or the grant reviewers will often see that as having a not very defined plan and idea. So strongly encourage you to identify a partner, identify specific partners, include their information in the application packet if it's allowed. And then you can go through the procurement process as needed later to actually get them on contract to help you work in the project. Does that seem appropriate response?
Yeah, I think so. There can be a lot of strength when you have a number of partners identified in the grant. For the funder, it can build confidence that, again, you've thought this through, you've seen where you need additional partners, expertise. And it's not always that you need them because of expertise. Sometimes it's because the nature of the project, if it's at a landscape scale, you're bringing in folks who are also, neighboring jurisdictions. That would be important, for example, to making sure your plan is implemented or something like that. So it's not always that you're bringing them on because of expertise. Sometimes it's just that these folks need to be involved so that this thing can get done. And as a funder, it's very, it builds confidence to see that those folks have been identified. You then can see that this thing is going to get done. It'll be implemented. And I think that the bid question is going to vary organization to organization. I've definitely been named in grants before by tribes where it didn't go out to bid. It was just, we partnered. I wrote my proposal, helped with the whole thing. You know, our organization was in there and it just came right through after it was funded. So I don't think it always has to go out to bid when you name a partner, but again, that will vary by organization.
And I'll just mention that Tawana also had another quick question, I think, asking if a tribe can seek reimbursement for grant writing costs, such as things like the costs associated with a grant writing consultant pre-award or project coordination, grants administration that is provided by a contractor. And many of those things that are part of the actual project, you can just identify them as a contractor that's going to provide those services. The pre-award grant writing effort is typically not covered and would be something that that partner could either, one, ask for funding from the tribe to pay for it up front, or two, they may just include that as cost of doing business and probably end up having higher costs to actually do the work that they would then bill later if they actually get hired on to be a partner later. So there's some of those costs. It just depends on the business strategy of that particular consultant. So thank you. Mead, I think that we can go to slide 14, and I think that that is yours.
Right. So we would like to do a quick poll to ask whether and get a sense for you all to see. We'll share the results back with you. Have you had success writing proposals in-house, working with consultants to write proposals, neither, or both? And so if you go to www.menti.com and you enter this code here on the screen, then you can fill out the poll and we can share those results back with you, or Chaz can, because I can't see them while I'm sharing my screen. And please feel free to add questions or reflections in the chat on how this has worked out for you. And while folks are doing this, I just might note that for academic partners, such as myself, helping with grants with external partners is just part of doing business. I don't know anyone who charges for doing that. It's just part of what we do. We write a lot of grants. And so I think it'll vary by partner who would even expect to get paid to work on a grant. Or to work on the proposal, not the grant. People need to get paid on the grant.
I have one person that doesn't see the poll, but we do have a lot of folks filling in the poll right now. So a couple people say they don't have the poll, but both of them say that they write in-house. And but we are seeing that at this point, 60% of folks write their grants in-house. About 22% are right. 25% use both in-house and consultants, and 17% have actually not used either. And then we have a very small percentage now that has only used consultants with success. But yeah, number of folks in the chat saying that they write them in-house. So cool. Yeah, 50% in-house, a little bit more than that. So
Great.
And thank you for all the folks writing into the chat. We're reading them and following. So I'm sorry if the poll didn't work for you. It looks like it has for quite a few folks though. And we have 128 people that are now registered in the workshop.
Great. All right. And one thing maybe that we didn't mention that I think I'm glad to see all the folks who are writing proposals in-house. I know Chaz talked about the recognition that that's a huge amount of time and investment to do that versus outside consultants. But one of the values of doing that work in-house, even though it's a lot of time, beyond the fact that it'll better reflect your team and your own knowledge and responsibility for that work that you're proposing, is that just writing a proposal is a big capacity building opportunity. And so if you're writing them in-house, you know, these proposals help you crystallize your ideas. I mean, I do a lot of reading when I write proposals, you know, to help back up what I'm saying and seeing what else is being done to justify the work. So that's another benefit of writing in-house, is even just writing the proposal, beyond whether it's funded or not, actually builds the capacity of your team to do, in this case, climate work. So it's good to see folks are writing these in-house. All right, so and we're going to give you another moment to fill out your worksheet here to think about who's on your team. So if you could use your worksheet, and if you don't have the worksheet, you can just write this down in a notebook or in a Word doc or however you take notes. Again, think about who you might want to include in your grant writing team for this idea. And again, you might actually have a real idea that you're planning on getting money for and writing a proposal for. If you don't, you can just think about a potential idea, something you might want to do down the road. Who would you work with? Thinking inside of your organization, potentially outside of your organization, and some of the potential folks we mentioned earlier. So we'll give you a few minutes to fill that out before we move on.
And Coral, can you put the link to the worksheet in the chat again? There's been quite a few folks that jump in since start.
Absolutely. And apologies for the background noise here, but I also wanted to reiterate that the recording of this workshop will be made available on the BIH Hub Climate Resilience website, as will the link to this participant worksheet and other notes and links that are shared in the Teams chat. So please look out for that in the next week or so.
Okay, Mead, why don't we go ahead and start talking about identifying potential funding opportunities. And yes, there will be one more opportunity to answer a poll, just so you know, Kelly. So, first of all, there's so many different opportunities to find funding, and especially in this last year, the number of funding opportunities have really exploded, especially in the energy and climate resilience fields. But there's a lot of funding out there for infrastructure and other types of grants. Those include federal funding, state funding, foundations, nonprofits, and even smaller collaborative groups. You know, and they're really, all of these funding opportunities, they're really trying to push their mission forward by helping and by providing funding in a way that they don't actually have to do all of the work themselves. You know, it benefits them to give away the funding and to allow you to accomplish your goals while helping them accomplish their goals. So it helps them to actually push their mission forward without having to do the work internally. Next slide. Here we have just a list of different funding opportunities or sources that you can identify, actually identify specific funding opportunities. One, the BIA Tribal Resilience Program, they just recently announced their grant for their annual program, and that's going to be due in October. Grants.gov has so many grant opportunities available that you will definitely be awash in grants. Different state agencies, nonprofits also put out grants, and it's really hard to keep track of all of them. But one source that you can use that helps consolidate information is the Tribal Climate Change Guide, which is hosted by the University of Oregon, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. Various newsletters like the Affiliated Tribes Northwest Indians Climate Change newsletter that we put out, and each of the regional climate adaptation science centers also have newsletters. And there's email lists that you can sign on to, and different various foundations. So if you're out looking for grants, one of the biggest problems is actually identifying what grants are available and whether or not you want to apply for it. So it's a big amount of effort, but not one that you can't be successful at. So next slide. If you go to the Tribal Climate Change Guide at the University of Oregon, and here's the website, you can also type in Tribal Climate Change Guide, and probably Google will find it for you. But if you go there, you'll see a page that looks quite a bit like this. And on there, you can search for different keywords or different geographies, but it will allow you to not only identify grants that are coming up rather quickly, but you can also scroll forward and look at ones that are coming up in the next few months. But you can see that it's chronological. I pulled this image out last week, and so one of the deadlines was July 13th. It's updated in real time as these grants start to expire. So you will, by going in here, you'll be able to identify one, grants that look like they're appropriate for the project that you started to identify in your worksheet. And we're going to go ahead and give you just a few minutes to explore this website and see if you can identify possibly one grant that might be relevant to the proposal that you are interested in thinking about right now. So we're just going to give you a couple minutes to take a look here. We're going to speed up a little bit so that we have time to get through our presentation. But let's give you a couple minutes. And Mead, can you just go ahead and go to the next slide here? While people are looking at that, I'm just going to mention that when I looked at that website, there's a few different programs that really jumped out to me of things that I know that some of our member tribes are really interested in right now. NOAA, the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, they have an Inflation Reduction Act, which people refer to as IRA. They have an Inflation Reduction Act grant that's focused on the Climate Resilience Regional Challenge. And that's going to be approaching, the deadline's coming up on August 21st, so just 3 weeks away. But I know that they have a large grant opportunity available. There's been a lot of information coming out recently about the EPA's Solar for All program, and a lot of tribes are very interested in this. Deadline of September 26th. And then, of course, the BIA Tribal Climate Resilience Program funding. They're hosting this. They're hosting this grant webinar right now, and their deadline is going to be approaching on October 13th. And they will offer more information about that later. So, Mead, I think we can go ahead and move on to the next slide, and I'll let you just talk about whether or not folks may want to apply for a specific opportunity.
Okay, so you've been looking through potential funding sources, looking at available calls for proposals, and then you need to make a decision. Are you going to actually apply for this opportunity, for this grant opportunity or not? So a few things to consider in deciding whether to apply. First, is this opportunity actually a good fit? Is it a good fit for your project idea? Is it aligned with what you want to do? And is it a good fit for your tribe or your organization? Are you an eligible applicant? Is it open to tribes, tribal organizations, or another organization that you're affiliated with? So taking some time to see whether this is really something that is suited to your idea and your organization. That is the first and most important step in deciding whether to apply. Is it a good fit or not? Is it even likely to get funded if you did apply? And then taking a really hard look at whether this particular opportunity is worth your time and effort. Some things to consider there is how much competition are you looking at? Is this something where it's only open to a relatively small group, it's regional? Hopefully you can see somewhere some information about or get some sense of how high the competition is for this. Is it going to be only like 10% of proposals are funded, or is it going to be like 80% of proposals are going to be funded? Any information you can get on that, any inkling, that's important information. And then thinking about, in addition to how much competition, how much effort is it going to be to apply? Is it a really light lift? Is it a very small proposal? How much detail is involved? How much time is this going to take you? You might decide to apply for a grant if it's a relatively light lift and low competition, and then maybe think harder if it's a lot of competition and a lot of effort. And so then you need to think about, okay, well, how much value, how big is this grant? Is it, if it's a $10 million grant, but it has quite a lot of competition and it's quite a lot of effort, but you think the fit is really good, you have a really good idea, your tribe, your organization is a really good fit, it might be worth that effort. It might be worth that long shot because the payoff is so big. But if it's a $10,000 grant, tons of competition, tons of effort to apply, maybe we won't go after that $10,000 one, just because the investment to benefit, the risk to benefit, that ratio is not that great. So taking some time to think about, like, how likely is it that you're going to get funded if you go after it? How much of your time and energy will it take? And what's the payoff going to be? Thinking about all of these things before you decide to commit to do this. Then you need to think, are you even able to apply? Are there internal policies at your tribe or organization that allow you to apply? Do you have to get permission to make sure you can? Are you the one who's able to do it? So taking some time to think about whether you're even able to do this, and getting any approval if needed. And this has been, I'll just note that especially some of these short turnaround, as folks are trying to get money out the door for, like, IRA funds or other things, tribes can be at a disadvantage if you need to get this before council for approval, and you need 30 days, at least, to get that, on the docket and put before them and signed off. So I think funders have been getting better at recognizing that that's a problem and trying to provide longer turnaround to ensure that they're not putting tribes at a disadvantage and having short application periods. But this is something to think about when you find an opportunity and you see the deadline. Can you make sure you're getting any approval that's needed? Do you have the time to do that? And hopefully the answer will be yes. And then finally asking, being really realistic with yourself, are you ready to apply and to do the work? Hopefully the answer is yes, and you can go for it. But again, applying for something that you're not sure you can get the work done for, that sets you up to be in a pretty difficult position if you do get the funding. So just taking that time to think like, can we get this done? Can we even apply? And again, hopefully a lot of the things that we considered earlier around partnership can help make that answer be yes. So maybe you can't personally get all the work done yourself. So you're thinking about a team, like can you partner to make sure you can get that work done? Maybe you don't have the time to apply, especially in a big lift just by yourself, but maybe that team you've identified for doing that work, maybe they can be your grant writing team and you all can get it done together. So thinking beyond doing this alone, thinking collaboratively can help turn that no into a yes, especially for those big pots of funding. So again, taking a moment before you go ahead and pull the trigger on applying to go through these questions and think about, is it a good fit, worth the effort? Are you able to apply? And are you ready to apply and do the work? All right, now we're going to give you a moment to think about those funding sources that you checked out earlier and just use your worksheet to jot down any promising funding sources and think about whether they're actually a good fit for your project and if you're ready to apply and have the team you need to do it. So just take one moment and jot that down if you haven't already in your worksheet.
Maybe if we go to the next web or next page, people can go to their Menti and fill out this next poll to see if they've had any success identifying climate-related funding sources. Or actually completing the grant.
You getting responses back there, Chaz?
Slowly. Looks like about there's some folks who have not had success yet. There's some who there's 50% that have identified climate-related funding sources, and some who have actually been successful. Less than 50%, but yeah, looks like folks are working their way through this kind of stuff. So, okay, we'll go ahead and go to the next slide, where I'm going to start talking a little bit about crafting. Oh, sorry, we're going to go ahead and move on. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and talk about crafting and submitting your proposal. So next slide, we're going to be kind of walking through a little bit, and we are going to start to go a little bit faster because we are running out of time. But it's really important that when you find a funding opportunity and you read through the RFP, that you read through the instructions, and that you follow the instructions very closely, that you make sure that you provide everything that's requested. You should make sure that you do provide that. And one trick that I do is that I actually copy and paste the text from the proposal into my Word document. So that way I have all the headings that they're requesting in the order that they're requesting it. And that therefore I'm almost guaranteed that I'm going to have the best chances of providing everything that they actually request. So you can go ahead and do that. The next thing is that I ensure that and we'll talk a little bit more here in the next slide, but that my project description aligns very strongly with that the program is hoping to fund. I am not just copying and pasting a proposal that did not get funded previously into a new RFP and hoping that it was successfully funded. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about that here in this next slide. It's really important that you frame your project to the specific RFP that you are looking at. For instance, you can fund a project, the same project, by framing it in different ways. And here's just some examples. Depending on the funding opportunity that's actually available, maybe the funding opportunity is from the USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service, and they're really interested in carbon or in soil health or in soil carbon sequestration in the soils. But you have an idea about water retention, that you would really like to help restore your freshwater springs, but that involves working the soils. If you were to reframe your project because of the specific opportunity, you might reframe that to focus on carbon sequestration versus water retention. Could still be the same type of project, and maybe you use a lot of the same language, but you are going to change the language and how you frame it. And here's some other examples. We talk about salmon recovery versus looking at research into culturally important species. There's lots of different ways that you can reframe a project, but it's really important that you frame the project specific to the RFP that you are interested in pursuing. Next, and I apologize for the messed up formatting here, but when thinking about your budget, developing a budget is one of the first things that I do when I start to write a grant proposal. As I design the budget, it helps. But when I know what the maximum amount of money is that I can ask for after identifying the proposal or the RFP, and then I can design the budget, it helps me to scale back the project into something that is actually fundable under this potential opportunity. It also helps me start to identify what the potential budget timeline is, and I'll get to that in the next slide, but that it helps to just think through the project as you start to design the budget. Before you start writing all the narrative, I really like to design the budget. So in doing so, I think it's also important that you ask for what you need to actually complete the work. Don't undercut your budget just because you want to make sure you get the proposal, because if you do that, you may not get you may get the project funded, but you may not actually be able to do the work. But smaller funding requests are typically easier to fund, so it's kind of a balancing act. And then you just don't want to ask for more than you can spend either. In some cases, you might ask for the moon, and you may actually get it, but then you may realize that you don't even have the ability to spend that kind of money on the project that you're trying to fund. So it's kind of a balancing act. So you need to really pay a lot of attention when you are designing your budget, but make sure that it's realistic and that you can actually achieve the work for the money that you're asking for. Next slide. In terms of developing your project timeline, you can, if you Google Gantt chart, you can find different templates that will help you develop a project like this, or a project timeline like what I am visualizing here. But it's really important that you think about your methods for how you're going to achieve the project and develop that timeline as you're thinking about your methods, and make sure that they're aligned. As you write out the narrative, it's really important that that timeline that you're going to present in a graphic and your methods are well aligned. Sometimes it's so easy to modify the narrative later, trying to fit things in and not update your timeline or not think about your methods, and things get all very confused. But it is really important and offers a lot of clarity to the funding agency when your methods and your timeline allow you to achieve the proposed project, but are also aligned with each other. It's I can, when I'm reviewing proposals and these things are not aligned, it tells me that the people writing the grant didn't quite think through everything, and that it raised the red flag, right? And so you don't want to do that. And I see that Sharina asked a question about whether it's better to ask for a little bit more on your budget proposal, or to go with smaller. It's really a balancing act. Sometimes you may want to add a contingency factor. Sometimes you may be, and typically folks seem to be always pushing their budget limit, so you don't have the opportunity or the flexibility to ask for more. But Mead, I'm going to go ahead and let you jump on and talk a little bit more about your funding strategy.
Yeah, we wanted to give you a minute to go back to your worksheet to think about what kind of funding strategy and timeline your project could require. So do you think you could fund your project with a single grant versus several? What kind of timeline do you expect? And again, that issue of smaller awards being more likely to be funded. Thinking about, is there a smaller scope that you could propose, or a series of smaller projects, so that you're not trying to do the big project with less money, because you don't want to get yourself in that situation. So is this something you could break down into several projects? Or is this something that really it's a single standalone grant? And since we're running a little short on time, and we've loved all the questions that you've been asking, and we've been trying to get to them as we go, and so here we are with a little bit less time to finish up. So sorry about that. I'm going to let you work on some of this in your worksheet. You can finish up when we wrap up, but we're going to move on to make sure we get through the rest of our materials. So, okay, now you're writing. You have your team. You picked your funding opportunity. You're ready to write. What's in a compelling proposal? Beyond a compelling budget and timeline, you actually need to do the proposal narrative. You need to write and describe to the funder what it is you're going to do. A good proposal tells a story. This is ultimately a storytelling exercise. And even though it's a little bit formulaic, proposals tend to have, these stories tend to have certain elements, there's a trajectory to a proposal, and the funders will be kind of expecting to see this. So typically, and the headers, by the way, like hopefully a good RFP, a good call for proposals will help give you some of this narrative arc with the headers that they ask for. But generally, you're going to start by describing the problem you're going to solve. So here it's climate change, or more specifically, it could be climate impacts on a particular species or cultural resource or infrastructure. Whatever it is that your project is seeking to address, what is the problem? You want to start really, really big here with the first sentence or two, the big problem, and then you kind of winnow in that first paragraph or two in the introduction and framing of your proposal. Big problem, climate, whatever the issue on climate is you want, and then getting to the specific problem that you're working on. So after describing the general problem, you're then telling what you're going to do. And when describing what you're going to do, you really want to point out kind of what's missing from previous work to address this problem, or what you can add to build on. And so briefly, you want to describe what's already been done to address this problem, either by your tribe or organization or more broadly. And where does that earlier work fall short in addressing the problem that you want? And this isn't disparaging earlier work. You're just describing you want to give a sense of the context of your work and put that within a broader context. You have this problem, what's already been done to address it, or maybe nothing's been done, but you want to point out what's missing so that you can then describe how your proposed project is going to meet that gap. It's going to help address what's been missing from previous work. So what is your project seeking to address, to address this gap or need? So, you know, previous work has assessed, for example, climate risks to our tribe's priority natural and cultural resources, and yet we have not identified response options for reducing those risks. Our project will complete an adaptation plan to identify strategies and actions. So that's kind of the arc of that introduction. Big problem, what's missing, what are we going to do to address that gap? Then you're going to get into your technical approach for solving this problem. You know, we're going to work with the following tribal departments and staff or community members or external partners, whoever's involved, to do the following. We're going to complete an adaptation plan. We're going to do a renewable energy audit or something like that. Where this is where you get into details of what exactly you're planning to do. But you can't launch into the details of what you're going to do without making us care and see that, oh, this is really important. That's the problem part. This is really important, and this thing really needs to get done. And then you tell us what you're going to do about it after you kind of hook us and we care, to where the funder's like, I would pay for this out of my own pocket, right? That's why this is good storytelling, because you want to actually get them to care. Then you talk about your approach. And now you have to, after telling us about why we should care and what your approach is, we need to know why you or your team are the ones who should be doing this work. So why us? You know, why are you the right people? How do I know that you're able to do that work? So you need to describe, you know, we successfully did X, Y, or Z. We're familiar with this work. If this is totally new work for you, then you describe other things you've been really successful at that are relevant to this work, or maybe you have partners who are coming in who've been successfully doing this. So you want to build confidence that you can actually get this done. And then you need to tell us something about how you're going to show the funder that you have succeeded once you do this. So, you know, are there any what kind of indicators would there be? Like, you know, we will have completed an adaptation plan. We will have installed, you know, this solar array. So tell us something about what success is going to look like, how you'll evaluate, what metrics you'll have to know it's been successful. And then ultimately, typically you might end by talking about, you know, sort of the broader contribution of this work. Will it have impact beyond this particular project itself? To the community, to external partners? Is this going to be a useful case study for other tribes or organizations? Will it add some important piece of data for those beyond the work itself? So these are kind of the general pieces of the story that you'll typically want to tell. And hopefully the grant template, as Chaz was describing, like use the headers they provide. Hopefully it will help provide a structure for you to tell this story. To then strengthen your proposal further, again, you want to back up what you propose to do with what you've already done as much as possible. So funders typically don't like feeling like they're funding a huge thing on their own. And so anywhere that you can describe any kind of leverage where any previous grant money or any investment by your organization has already been made that is relevant to this work. So the funder feels like they're getting big bang for their buck, like, oh, we're building on this other investment, or, oh, they've already done all this work and now we can add to that. They really like that. So as much as you can to back up what you propose to do with what you've already done and show that you have been successful. You also want to make sure your project is described as being achievable and that it actually is achievable, so that you're proposing something you can actually do. So this means that you're going to have to provide a certain amount of detail so that the funder can see what it is, that be really clear about what you're saying you're going to do, and that you can get it done. And then finally, as Chaz was saying, you know, you want to, as much as possible, mirror like use the language and the style that was used in the RFP. That makes it so much easier for the funder to follow, to map on what you're saying with what they want to actually pay for. So language in the RFP, like put that language back in your proposal, the style they use, the headers they use, and then really show some enthusiasm. These don't have to be dry technical proposals. You can really be creative in them, tell a good story in them, and your enthusiasm will make them enthusiastic for doing this work and funding it. And then really just making it readable. They're reading a lot of proposals. They're tired. You want to make it easy for them. So use clear and concise language, highlight key points. There's a really key message, like this is the really important part of what I'm trying to tell you. Like make it bold, underline it. You don't want to overuse that, but there should be like maybe 2 or 3 places in your grant. If it's really important, you like bold it, highlight it, make sure they can see it because they're reading a lot of these things. If you have some kind of complex concept you're trying to convey, think about using a figure to, you don't want to use up too much space, but think about using figures or photos, anything that can make this come alive and easier to look at, because again, they're reading lots of text. And then you will probably be asked to provide an executive summary. You want to actually write that last. So you have all of your material put together, you've written everything, then you can go back and write this last. Usually your goals, your budget, your timeline, partners, expected benefits, and again, that applicability to the broader audience. For further assistance, again, the Climate Adaptation Science Centers, these are regional centers across the country. They have tribal liaisons, and this is helping tribes, supporting their work and applying for grant funding is a part of their work. And so we encourage you to reach out to the tribal liaisons. These are folks who are funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, located at a tribal organization to serve the tribes in the regional tasks in their resilience efforts. So you will get a recording of this. We can share our slides. You can look this up, but you can also just Google Climate Adaptation Science Center or just CASC tribal liaisons and you'll find them. So in summary, writing a good grant is a skill that can be learned. So if you're not successful the first time, or if this seems really daunting, you're just getting started, don't worry, you can get better at this. It just takes really practice. And something I would highly recommend is anyone who's willing to share a successful grant with you, particularly around a related topic, those are gold. Seeing a successful proposal and what it looks like is gold, because then you're like, oh, I get it now. Like I see what that's supposed to look like. So if you have other folks at your tribe or your partners who have successfully gotten climate grant funding, especially if it's for the specific RFP you're looking at, man, you can't beat that as a resource. So don't be afraid to ask for those. And again, hopefully this theme has come across all along, but you don't have to do it alone. Ask for help. Find partners to do it with you. And again, you don't have to fund everything all at once. So consider a longer-term funding strategy. Think about how to break it down, get that barrier to entry lower. I know right now there is so much money floating around from the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's easier said than done because there is a lot of money right now. People want to take advantage of it. But again, think about how you might break this down into more manageable projects if this is something you're just getting started at. And finally, think about this as ultimately a storytelling exercise. You're trying to craft a compelling story in your proposal. Hopefully, keeping that in mind can make this a little bit less daunting too if you're not as experienced. Your number one job is to make the funder care about what it is that you're doing. So starting off strong by that big picture, like, what is this issue that we're dealing with? Why does it matter for your tribe? Why is it important? You can include actual stories in your proposal. So thinking about how to get that hook, get them to care, and then making it clear that it's achievable and for both the funder and for you, because you don't want to propose anything you can't actually get done. And with that, we have just a couple minutes and I'm going to stop sharing, or actually, you know what? Chaz, can you put the link in the chat for I sent, you should have that link, hopefully, Chaz, because I sent it to you yesterday and I can't put it in the chat while I'm sharing my screen. But we have
I did already.
Thank you. We have a very, very brief evaluation for you. If you wouldn't mind filling it out, it can help us do a better job of this in the future if we offer this again. And so please take a moment to do that. And thank you all so much for attending. It's great seeing so many on the call today. We hope this has been useful. If you have more questions, please reach out. This is a really good time to be applying for climate-related funding. There's a lot out there, and we wish you all the success in your grant writing efforts. So thank you all so much for coming today. And we have just 1 minute. I can stay on for a couple minutes. I don't know if we're stopping right away, but if anyone has any last questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or if we get cut off at 11 sharp, feel free to email us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chaz and Mead, for the fabulous workshop. We really appreciate y'all coming and facilitating and organizing all of this. Just to wrap up to everyone else, again, I know that you all saw plenty in the chat, but we will be having our BIA Branch of Travel Climate Resilience FAQ webinar for our fiscal year 23 annual awards next Wednesday, excuse me, August 2nd. And there's a link to that in the chat. If you need it again, I'm happy to send it to you. But the recording from this workshop, as well as all of the notes with all of the links, that worksheet that you all were working on, all of this will be made available on our website within the next week or so.
I see a lot of questions, Coral. Do you have to hop off right now, or do we have a couple? I can stay for a few minutes.
Yeah, we can stay on for a few minutes if there's any last questions. We're not going to be answering any questions specific to BIA Travel Climate Resilience's annual awards because we're doing that next week. But we're happy to stay on with you, Mead, and if there's any questions about general grant writing, we're happy to help out where possible.
Okay. Yeah, I can stay on for a few minutes if folks want to get some of these questions in there. I see a ton in the chat. I haven't been able to see the chat this whole time, so I don't even know where to begin. Coral, do you want to, have you been looking in the chat? Do you want to help me out here to see what I could?
Yeah, the